climate change, I mean, the consequences of climate change should be seen as a national security threat to all countries, right? I mean, the likelihood is that climate change is going to have a massive impact on the populations of every country. And if we think of, and we tend to think of national security in very strictly military terms. And so it's hard for people to think of the consequences of climate change being a threat to national security. But if we think of security more generally, about the safety and security of the population of a country, climate change is going to be a threat to that security.
Powered by International Committee of the Red Cross.
Hello, this is Legally Speaking on DawnNews English, and I'm your host, Ayesha Malik. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the link between climate change and armed conflicts. The environment and conflict are interlinked, as the environment is not only a casualty in armed conflicts, but can also serve as a tool with which to wage war, and as a result may be used for military advantage. It can also cause more conflict with environmental effects and environmental damage, leading to greater competition over resources. And this may make conflicts more likely in the future as it loads the dice in creating a threat multiplier effect, which increases the likelihood of violence. As with climate change, conflicts are unfair and unevenly distributed in that they increase the vulnerability of those already vulnerable. In today's episode, we'll be talking to Professor Craig Martin about how climate change may make conflicts more likely in the future and the ways in which the current use of force framework can be expanded to allow for the use of force against climate rogue states and what that means, as well as the potential rise of a phenomenon of atmospheric intervention. We hope you enjoy the episode. And for this episode of Legally Speaking, we are very delighted to have with us Professor Craig Martin, who teaches public international law, the law of armed conflict, constitutional law, and professional responsibility at Washburn Law University, and he is co-director of the International and Comparative Law Center. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to start off by asking you just very generally about the link that you see between climate change and national security and the ways in which climate change will drive more armed conflict in international relations and how you see that relationship.
Right. Well, I think that, a number of states, and indeed even within the United States, which, as your listeners will know, has a rather complicated relationship with the whole concept of climate change, some of the primary national security agencies, including the Department of Defense, the CIA, the National Intelligence Agency, they all recognize that climate change is going to pose threats and risks to national security. And it does so in a number of different ways. Most directly, of course, the consequences of climate change are going to impact national security infrastructure, national security capability. There are a number, for example, in the United States, military bases that are close to the coast and therefore are going to be affected by a rising sea level and things of that nature. But less directly, perhaps, climate change is going to affect national security in a host of different ways. So, the anticipation or prediction is that climate change is going to cause massive migration in coming decades. There's going to be massive dislocation as certain areas of the world become less and less inhabitable, where food insecurity and water insecurity increases because of the changes to weather patterns and climate patterns. And that's going to force massive migration. And we already see the extent to which migration in the United States and in Europe has caused political disruption, and migration alone is likely to increase the possibility of armed conflict. Syria, for example, the Syrian civil war is attributed in part to a famine in Syria that was a consequence of climate change. And in addition, the prediction again is that the consequences of climate change, again, the sort of cascading results of food insecurity, water insecurity, migration, is going to cause states to fail and international institutions to fail. And therefore, there's going to be far more likely armed conflict among states for scarce resources, armed conflict resulting from the failure of states. If we look at, for example, the precedents of Somalia as being a failed state. Not to say that the failure of Somalia was due to climate change, but the existence of failed states causes insecurity in the areas around that state, right? And it becomes a um, a location for conflict, which spills over borders and creates armed conflict in neighboring territory. So, for all of these reasons, there is an anticipation that there's going to be an increase in armed conflict, and that climate change is going to cause, uh, threats and risks to national security. And I think, I mean, just to round out the discussion, I mean, just from a large uh, picture perspective, climate change, I mean, the consequences of climate change should be seen as a national security threat to all countries, right? I mean, the likelihood is that climate change is going to have a massive impact on the populations of every country. And if we think of, and we tend to think of national security in very strictly military terms. And so it's hard for people to think of the consequences of climate change being a threat to national security. But if we think of security more generally, about the safety and security of the population of a country, climate change is going to be a threat to that security. And therefore, we should be thinking about climate change in national security terms, not in the sense of we should have a military response or we should be thinking in military terms, but in the sense that we should be thinking about prioritizing response to climate change. It should be one of the top priorities in the way that national security is, because climate change is going to pose a risk to the populations of many countries.
And just a little bit more about the criticism that has been heaped onto the securitization of climate change and the ways in which
Right.
that differs between the global north and the global south. So perhaps in the global north, that securitization will mainly mean militarization of borders to keep out climate refugees or climate migrants, whereas in the global south, that would be the much awaited water wars and wars over natural resources. Do you think that's probably the dichotomy we're going to see, the difference between the two?
I certainly think that's a major part of it. And I think maybe just to explain to, for some listeners who may not be familiar with the term securitization, right, is this idea that we sort of make an issue into a national security issue, which we then, the response to national security issues typically is military. It's, the mobilization of state violence, of the suspension of democratic values, of more secrecy, and so forth. And so there is this real concern, certainly in the environmental movement, that, securitizing the response to climate change is going to be a very negative thing.
Yeah.
My own view is, well, we should be thinking of climate change and the response to climate change in security terms, but without the securitization. Like, I don't think a military response is the right response to climate change itself, right? We should be trying to mitigate the causes of climate change. We should be trying to adapt to climate change without sort of securitizing. But I do think that you're quite right that, one of the unfortunate consequences of the effects of climate change is going to be that kind of securitization. You are going to see, in response to massive migration, efforts by the global north to harden their borders, to use military forces to try to keep migrants out. And yes, I do think that elsewhere in the world, I don't know that it's entirely a dichotomy. I think you may see the securitization of resource conflict erupting even in the global north, right? And so, yes, I think that as the consequences of climate change worsen, you are going to see an increase of tension over resources like water. And just, I think people don't quite fully appreciate the extent to which climate change is going to, for example, potentially alter monsoon patterns, right? So areas of countries that have depended on monsoons for, like, over 1,000 years are all of a sudden going to find that those monsoon patterns are changing in a way that is going to cause massive food and water insecurity, which then creates incentives for, trying to get it from somewhere else, like across the border, which leads to conflict.
Yeah, and that definitely applies to the province I'm speaking from, Punjab, right now, but in the context as well of the water war between Pakistan and India. Pakistan is a lower riparian state. India has threatened to cut off the water, and Pakistan has said unequivocally, we will interpret that as an act of war. And that's why your articles and your work on atmospheric intervention and about how the jus ad bellum can respond to such situations between states is so interesting. And I kind of want to go into that in a bit more detail and that. So I wanted to start off by asking you, what is a climate rogue state?
Right. So, I mean, it's a term I coin in this article called Atmospheric Intervention, where I posit that some countries um, that are seen to be completely not only ignoring and disregarding, but almost spurning their climate change obligations and contributing to what is a global problem and thereby increasing the risk of climate change consequences to everyone else are increasingly going to be seen as a threat to the national security of other countries, right? If we think that, and going back to your first question, if we think that climate change can pose a threat to national security, which many, increasing numbers of countries do in their strategic documents, they say, look, the consequences of climate change poses a national security threat. Well, if some country is increasing the probability of those consequences, is contributing to that risk in a way that is like recklessly disregarding their obligations, then it strikes me that countries are going to begin to see that country that is increasing the risks of climate change, of you know, going against the entire global effort to try to reduce the risk of climate change. In other words, throwing gasoline on the fires, if you will, is going to be seen as a rogue, is going to be seen as a national security threat in its own right. And this isn't entirely hypothetical or theoretical, right? So while I was writing that article, President Macron of France uh, made comments about the Brazilian destruction of the Amazon and suggested that there might come a time when states would have to use force to prevent a country from doing something like what Brazil was planning to do in terms of accelerating the destruction of the Amazon. The Amazon being a great carbon sink and something that the world depends on for removing greenhouse uh, gases from the atmosphere. And so there is this idea that I think is developing that certainly countries have obligations, and the International Court of Justice just 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago handed down an incredibly important decision that spelled out the obligations of states, both under treaty and customary international law, in cooperating to reduce the harm caused by climate change, and therefore for having an increasingly ambitious targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And if a country flouts those obligations, then I think increasingly states are going to see that country as being a climate rogue state. And unfortunately, I'm sitting in a country that is doing just that right now. And under the Trump administration, the United States is not only failing to comply with its obligations, but it seems to be perversely flouting those obligations in a proactive way, doing everything it can to increase its contribution to the climate change risk. And I think that that is the kind of behavior that is going to increasingly be seen as rogue behavior.
Right. And in terms of how the current jus ad bellum, the current framework relating to the use of force, how do you think that that falls short in dealing with states' climate concerns, about other states, their anxieties generally about climate change? And how do you think it could expand to accommodate those concerns?
Right. So I think the jus ad bellum sort of falls short in two different ways. And just to explain to listeners who may not be familiar with the term, the jus ad bellum is the international legal regime that governs the use of force. It's the legal regime that first of all, prohibits the use of force against the political independence and territorial integrity of another country. This is articulated in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter as the bedrock principle of the United Nations system. And it has a couple of exceptions. In other words, it permits uses of force in response to an armed attack, in self-defense of that country or in defense of other countries. So this is the right of self-defense. And then a second exception permits the use of force when authorized by a UN Security Council resolution. In other words, this is part of a collective security system in which the United Nations can authorize countries to use force to address the aggression of another country. And so we saw this, and this has been used in the Korean conflict in the 1950s. It was used more recently in 2011 when the UN Security Council authorized NATO and allied countries to use force in Libya. And these are the only two exceptions, right? And so one of the shortcomings, if you will, or one of the ways in which jus ad bellum isn't ideally situated to respond to this situation is that if a country views a neighbor as a climate rogue state, as a country that is contributing to the risk of climate change and thereby causing direct harm to, the country, that doesn't satisfy the test for self-defense. It doesn't constitute an armed attack, right? I mean, it's this strange distinction between an armed attack is sudden, it's kinetic, it causes harm, and therefore it triggers a right to use force in self-defense. But if a country does something slowly that threatens your national security, and it's not kinetic, it's not a violent action, but somehow, it's the analogy is, between stabbing and poisoning someone. If someone attacks you with a knife, you're able to defend yourself, but somehow if they're poisoning you slowly, you don't have that same right of self-defense. At least that's the way international law has operated. And so jus ad bellum doesn't provide a justification, an exception for using force to prevent, for example, to go back to President Macron's point about using force against Brazil, the jus ad bellum wouldn't justify that, right? Unless you could get the UN Security Council to authorize it, which, often, given this the UN Security Council's gridlock and the extent to which permanent members block those kinds of resolutions, it's unlikely you would get a UN Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force against a country that was a climate rogue state. So the jus ad bellum doesn't tend to provide the justification for a use of force, which may arguably be actually a good thing. Otherwise, countries would be, we've seen that countries tend to use these exceptions as pretexts for using force against neighbors. But the second shortcoming, and perhaps the more important shortcoming in jus ad bellum, is that while the jus ad bellum would prohibit the use of force against a climate rogue state, like if India decided or Pakistan decided that India was in some way engaging in conduct that made them into a climate rogue state and was threatening the national security of Pakistan, Pakistan would not have a justification under the jus ad bellum to use force against India. But the problem is that the jus ad bellum also doesn't impose a sufficient constraint these days on countries. So it's not likely to actually prevent Pakistan from using force against India in a way that would be unlawful, right? And if we just have to look at Ukraine as the latest example of how the jus ad bellum regime has been unsuccessful in preventing that kind of unlawful use of force, right? And so I would suggest that as the consequences of climate change get worse and the level of fear and anxiety increases in populations regarding the consequences of climate change, there are going to be demands on governments to do something about some neighbor that is engaging in flagrantly unlawful conduct with respect to climate change. And that while the jus ad bellum regime should prohibit the use of force against that climate rogue state, it's not likely to, right? The constraints that jus ad bellum imposes have weakened over time as a result of the global war on terror and a number of other developments since the year 2000. It has become weaker, and therefore it's unlikely to really prevent increasing armed conflict.
And so we might see it in the form of a new customary exception in the form of atmospheric intervention.
So there is this possibility, and then that's indeed what my article is about, is that I'm saying, look, we might see the emergence of a new exception, or at least arguments for a new exception, right? And again, we're sort of getting into the legal weeds of jus ad bellum, which again, some of your listeners may not be that familiar with, but since 2000, we've seen efforts to weaken the jus ad bellum regime by a number of states, including the United States in particular. So in the aftermath of 9/11, the United States sought to invade Iraq. It tried to do so on arguments that they were allowed to engage in preventative self-defense, because there had, of course, been no armed attack from Iraq. There was no imminent armed attack from Iraq. But the Bush administration said, well, but there was a very possible attack in the future and the development of nuclear weapons, and they didn't have to wait for a mushroom cloud to, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was this effort to create a new or expanded justification to the doctrine of self-defense. Similarly, in the global war on terror, there was an attempt to expand and weaken the conditions for self-defense in saying that states could use force against terrorist organizations or individuals in non-consenting states where that state was unwilling or unable to deal with that threat. Well, now, again, that was not part of the normal or traditional understanding of self-defense, but there was this effort by a group of developed countries, the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Israel, at the forefront, to say that, well, if that state is unwilling or unable to deal with the threat, then the threatened country, the country that's threatened by this terrorist organization, could use force, and it would be not only a use of force against the terrorist organization, of course, that organization is in the territory of another state, so it ends up being a use of force against that state. And Pakistan, by the way, was a victim of this frequently, right? So in the sort of Western provinces, the United States used drones to attack members of the Taliban in Pakistan quite often, and relied on this unwilling or unable doctrine. So all of these steps sort of weakened the jus ad bellum regime. At the same time, there were efforts to create a new exception. Right? So I've said there's two exceptions to the prohibition on the use of force. One is self-defense. The other is UN Security Council authority. There was an attempt to make an exception for what was called humanitarian intervention. So where a government was engaging in crimes against humanity or war crimes or other systematic abuses of their own population, it was said that they had sort of lost or abdicated some of their sovereignty, and other countries could enter forcefully using military force to save the civilian population. This was called humanitarian intervention. And there were arguments and claims that this should be a new exception and that it was emerging as a new principle of customary international law. But I think the reality is it has not emerged. And so it may be emerging, but it has not yet crystallized. And it shows how difficult it is and how long it takes for these new principles to emerge. And so is it possible that there would, again, I think that we would see arguments like the American arguments for preventative self-defense and unwilling or unable doctrine. There would be arguments for there should be an exception for using force against states that are contributing to what is a global crisis in the sense that they're contributing to the causes of climate change. But whether that would actually emerge as a new exception or whether it would just further weaken jus ad bellum and allow for the use of force, whether it's lawful or unlawful. And I think that's the more important point, is that we're likely to see that kind of use of force. Whether we ultimately decide it was lawful or unlawful, the jus ad bellum regime is not going to prevent it. And there are going to be, excuse me, there are going to be all these arguments that, well, there's a new emerging exception to the prohibition on use of force, allowing us to attack countries that are contributing in this material way to a global threat.
Yeah, and I wonder whether I kind of see the global south as almost being split along those two lines. So it's countries like Pakistan could well be patient zero for this kind of new arguments for a new emerging custom where they have to take that kind of step to protect something which they feel is existential. And in doing so, they'll be breaking the law and adding to state practice in the same way that we saw with unable and unwilling. Or they'll go the other way, which is how the Global South largely responded to humanitarian intervention, which will stymie the development of that as being a customary norm, especially in light of the fact that the Global South's largest complaint against the Global North has been that you developed unencumbered by climate change obligations, and we want the right to do so as well. Is that how you see states kind of diverging on this?
Yeah, no, I think that you're quite right. I think that the global south can't be really thought of in monolithic terms when it comes to climate change because they have very different interests and vulnerabilities. Like some countries, a lot of countries in the global south are going to be, very vulnerable to the consequences of climate change. But at the same time, as you say, a lot of global south countries want to rely on the use of fossil fuels for economic development and resent being told by the global north, well, you can't do that. We did that, but you now can't do that. And you have to take steps that are going to make development much more difficult. And different countries in the global south have different resources. And so that too is going to, it changes the incentive structure. So I really do think that, and we already see this at the COPs, right? So, the global south does not take a sort of monolithic position at the COP, Barry. So, for example, the low-lying small island states take very different positions from the large global south countries like India and Brazil. And so I would expect that we are going to see that kind of splintering of positions and even, policy actions on the part of global south countries.
And I also wanted to ask you on that question of resources about you've written a lot about geoengineering. It's something that I understand very, very little about. So it's a bit too sciencey for me. But in terms of how do you see that culminating in greater conflict as well, in terms of unilateral geoengineering efforts by states?
Yeah. So, I mean, I should explain at the outset for listeners for whom this is really new. I mean, geoengineering is a term that encompasses a whole host of different technologies, right? It's any and all technologies that are trying to alter the climate system in some way for our benefit, right? So it includes things like carbon capture, which is just, technologies that try to suck carbon dioxide or methane for that matter out of the atmosphere and, like, for example, turn it into bricks that can be buried underground. And, if we could master carbon capture at scale, like that would be wonderful. Like it would solve all our problems. But there are other technologies like solar radiation modification or SRM, which are not getting at the causes of climate change, right? So carbon capture is actually trying to, affect the causes of climate change by taking the very cause of climate change out of the atmosphere. And it would have the benefit of reducing the consequences of climate change, the symptoms of climate change, but it's actually getting at the causes. SRM, and there's a whole host of different kinds of solar radiation modification. they're not actually getting at the causes of climate change at all. They're just trying to address the symptoms, right? So it's basically trying to reduce the amount of sunlight that's hitting the planet and thereby trying to cool us. You know, it's like having an umbrella. It's not stopping the rain, but it is sort of keeping us dry. And so one of the forms of solar radiation modification that I address in that article that you mentioned is called stratospheric aerosol injection. And what this involves is injecting sulfates, is the typical aerosol, but it's injecting some kind of aerosol into the stratosphere, uh, which has the effect of shielding or creating a bit of a shield against sunlight, right? And we know that this works because volcanoes do this. When we see a volcano erupt, it pumps a bunch of sulfate particles into the stratosphere, and we see a cooling effect around the world, right? So the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in the 1990s resulted in a decline or reduction in global average temperatures by about 0.5 degrees Celsius, which is pretty significant,
Yeah.
right, for over a year, right? So we know that it does reduce temperatures, but it does nothing to reduce the causes of climate change, right? So greenhouse gas concentrations are continuing to increase. So there's a whole host of really significant risks associated with this stratospheric aerosol injection, which is called SAI, right? So for one thing, it would almost encourage states to continue burning fossil fuels and to continue pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere because we're like, well, we solved the problem. You know, we've got the umbrella
Yeah.
now, right? Um, and the problem with that is if you become addicted, right? So once you start this, you have to continue because if you stopped after 10 years, well, there's been this buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere in that 10 years. And so if you stop, there would be what's called a termination shock. You would see this
Right.
very significant, very rapid spike in temperatures, which would cause chaos in terms of biodiversity, right? Species would not have any time to adapt to this all of like rapid increase in temperature. But in addition, SAI is going to have unpredictable and unintended consequences on weather and climate systems, right? So it's already understood that SAI would affect monsoon patterns in sort of your part of the world, for example, right? So places that used to be wet and would have monsoons would all of a sudden become deserts and vice versa. So it would create food insecurity, water insecurity. It would cool the planet on average, but it would be unequally distributed, right? It would cause climate consequences that would be unpredicted, and some of it would be predictable. Right? Some of these could be predicted, and you would imagine like some countries who look at the models and say, "Well, hang on." If you try to engage in this SAI, we are going to become a desert. There's no way we're going to allow you to do this, right? And then there are other risks as well. If you use sulfates, which is the cheapest form of SAI, it would cause massive acidification of the ocean with huge biodiversity consequences, right? Um, the reason that SAI is so important, though, is that it's really cheap, right? So a lot of countries have it within their capability. The technology exists. It's not very difficult technologically, and it's like relatively speaking, incredibly cheap. So even countries in the global south could mount SAI, like unilateral SAI efforts. So in other words, say, well, we're not waiting. The global north is like not doing anything. Like right now, the United States is turned its back on climate change response. So we're going to take the bull by the horns and we are going to do something to keep our country cool. And in my view, that would be seen by other countries as a possible threat to national security. because if
Right.
you do not want SAI and are worried about the consequences of SAI, and some country that's in your region has started to fly planes up into the stratosphere and dumping sulfates in there for purposes of geoengineering, that's going to be another contributor to armed conflict because countries are going to say, well, hang on, we're not going to allow this. This is a threat to our national security. And so I would say that, the probability of SAI being conducted in the next 10 years is now very high, just because it is so technologically feasible and cheap. And the United States, before the election, set up a branch of government and funded, and it was a small amount of funding, but several $1 million were put into this department that would be monitoring unilateral SAI. So they were monitoring the stratosphere to try to detect any country or entity. And I should say that, SAI is feasible even for corporate entities. And a couple of companies have already started business models saying, we're going to put sulfates into the atmosphere and sell as carbon credits, the cooling effect that we've created. I mean, it's kind of a weird business plan, but they think they have a business model where they can sell carbon credits to companies as offsets, carbon offsets, based on the amount of cooling that they produce by putting sulfates into the stratosphere. So it sounds like science fiction, but this is coming. And, part of the argument we make in the article that my co-author and I wrote that article about was there is a need for governance. There is right now, there's no governance structure in place to constrain and regulate and govern the research and development and the ultimate deployment of SAI.
And you talk of lack of governance structure just in that area, but also in terms of what we're seeing in the global order and international community generally. I've never seen so many articles about the death of international law and the demise and the failure of international law. And we've seen, especially this year, it's been conflict after conflict. So when we need an unprecedented amount of cooperation among states, what we're seeing is a descent into conflict. And do you see that continuing? And do you see any hope in that international law can offer in terms of returning to a time of cooperation?
I hate
Loaded
to,
question, I know.
well, and I hate to end an interview on such a down note, but I don't have a lot of optimism, right? I mean, the United States under the Trump administration has turned its back on international law, is really, quite proactively trying to destroy the international legal system in a myriad of ways, not only walking away from and trying to undermine the international climate change regime, but is obviously, with its tariff regime, is just overturning the international trade regime. It's withdrawn from the WHO and turned its back on international responses to pandemics. So, I mean, and of course, at the end, at the center of all of this, as you point out, are the number of conflicts and the extent to which not only the jus ad bellum, which is the regime that governs when and under what conditions states may use force, but also the international humanitarian law regime, which is the regime that governs how states can conduct themselves in the context of armed conflict, are both being undermined and undermined in ways that just really attack the structural integrity of those legal regimes. So, the Ukraine conflict sees the undermining of both regimes, jus ad bellum and IHL, and the Gaza situation is just terribly undermining the aspects of both regimes, but more particularly the IHL regime. And I think that part of the problem for international law that this causes is that it just lays bare and provides so much support for arguments, particularly in the global south, for the extent to which the entire regime is is one of double standards and hypocrisy, right? That the global north simply imposes this so-called international legal order uh, as a political tool. And when it is inconvenient for them, they flout it, right? And, in the past, I would have tried to defend against those arguments and say, well, no, no, no. But right now, it's very difficult because that is precisely what is happening. The failure of Western countries to really respond adequately and to rein in Israel's conduct in Gaza is just seen as a massive failure of the international legal system. And then, finally, the United States at this point really endorsing in many ways the Russian aggression against Ukraine is hard to square with the continued operation of the international legal regime. So, there's an Israeli scholar, Eyal Ben-Venisti, who wrote a really interesting essay in Just Security a few months ago, which was, I think, the most optimistic one could be, which is to say that, international law is under attack, and is at risk of sort of being incorporated into sort of empire, as he puts it. But that international law has a long memory, and that we've seen in the past instances where international law has been sort of suspended, if you will, during sort of authoritarian eras, but it comes back. And so I think there is this hope that yes, international law is not dead, that it will return, but certainly it is not operating and functioning very well right now. And in particular, in the context of climate change, I'm very, very, like everyone, very concerned that international law is just not up to the task right now, given the extent to which the United States is opting out of the regime, and is not only disregarding, but is undermining the collective response to what is a global crisis.
Yeah, and I think Eyal Ben-Venisti, in the article he wrote that we hope that the project of international law would not have been in vain. And I remember putting that on a presentation for my students because it was a glimmer of hope in what has been a pretty bad 2 years for international law in particular. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for tuning in to that episode of Legally Speaking about the link between climate change and armed conflict. Join us next week for future episodes.
Powered by International Committee of the Red Cross.